Hello, I'm John Summers, a director at FMA, who in partnership with the Wallace Foundation helped design the strongnonprofits.org website to bring tools and resources for effective financial management to organizations throughout the nonprofit sector. The purpose of the video that we are putting together here is to walk through the program-based budgeting tool that is available for download here on strongnonprofits.org. Understanding what it actually costs to run your organization's programs is a critical first step in making good financial decisions, including knowing where and how to shore up fundraising or where to reduce expenses. This tool helps you do that by building your organization's budget on a program-by-program basis, and also by helping you to understand the financial impact of each of your programs on the organization's bottom line. Before we get into the tool itself, I think it would be helpful to review a couple of important budgeting concepts that will help us in understanding the design and the functioning of the tool. First, we have the distinction between natural and functional expenses. So natural expenses are expenses classified by the nature of the expense. Examples include salaries, rent, utilities, supplies, and so on. Functional expenses, on the other hand, are expenses classified by the type of activity for which the expense was incurred. So in the nonprofit sector, that would be distinguished among programmatic, management in general, also called administrative expenses, or fundraising expenses. If you are familiar with a statement of functional expenses, one of the audited financial statements in a typical nonprofit audit, you will be familiar with this format, which is functional expenses represented in the columns on a statement of functional expenses. On the example in front of you, we have program services, management in general, and development, also known as fundraising. And then the rows represent natural expenses. So salaries, employee benefits, payroll taxes, and so on are the natural expense categories. A further distinction that will be important in using the program-based budget builder is the distinction between what we call specific and shared expenses. So specific expenses, also sometimes called direct expenses, are expenses that can be specifically assigned to one or more programs or functions based on time or money spent directly on each program or function. So examples of a specific expense are salaries for program personnel. So those expenses are specific to the program that those staff members work on. Salaries for physical staff is also a specific expense because it's an expense directly incurred by the finance function of an organization, one of the administrative or management and general functions. Fundraising expenses also specific. If it's, again, staff salaries or expenses associated with a fundraising event, those are all specific to the fundraising function. In contrast to a specific expense, we have a shared, or also sometimes called an indirect expense. And those are expenses that are shared among some or all programs and functions because they benefit more than one program or function within the organization. When we have shared expenses, we have to allocate those expenses among the different areas that benefit from those services on the basis of an appropriate allocation methodology, and we will talk more about that when we look at the tool itself. So some examples of shared expenses are rent and utilities in a common space. So if we have an organization in which all of our programs are housed, obviously, we don't write a separate rent check for each of those programs. We write one rent check, and then we have to allocate that to the programs that work out of that facility. With that as background information, we can now do a demonstration of the tool itself. The spreadsheet opens to an instructions tab, so if there are any questions that you have that don't get answered in this demo, you can find a line-by-line guide to the template on this tab that will give you the basic functionality and what should go into each element of the spreadsheet. So the place we're going to start is the first tab labeled Budget Worksheet, and this is where we begin to build the expense budget for our nonprofit organization. So you'll see line 5 is a breakdown of each of the program elements of the organization. We've got room for up to 7 programs to enter in this spreadsheet. and also a column for administration and a column for fundraising, so the two common support functions for all nonprofit organizations. And the way the template works is for each expense item in our organization, we will enter the expense item and the amount, and then assign or allocate that cost among the various programs and functions of the organization. So we do that for our personnel costs in the top section, full-time and part-time personnel, and in the second section we do that for our non-personnel or OTPS costs. So that will include specific expenses, again, expenses that are particular to one single function or program, and shared expenses, those expenses that are common across the organization, and we will allocate either by our personnel numbers or by some other method. And what that gives us is a total budget for the organization as a whole, as well as a total budget or cost projection for each individual program and function of the organization. So this will make more sense for our walkthrough if we look at an example that's already been populated with some hypothetical data. So let's go to that next. In this example, the first thing to point out is this caution or warning on the top, which is enter data into the highlighted cells only, the yellow colored cells. The white cells are empty, so you can ignore those, and the gray cells are actually formulas or calculations. So the information that we put into the template in the highlighted cells will be calculated in the gray cells, so that's where we will see our output information. The one exception to that is here on the top line, where we can enter the names of the different programs. So you'll remember in the blank template, we had just program 1, program 2, program 3. You can customize those in this template with the names of the programs of your organization. So in this hypothetical example, let's say we're looking at an organization that provides after-school services to elementary school students, middle school students, and high school students. So those are our program areas. And then, of course, we have administration and fundraising, which again are the common shared services for all nonprofit organizations. If you want to add additional programs, again up to 7 that are built into the template, you can click this plus button, which will open up the additional columns. So the top section of the spreadsheet is for personnel or salary and wage expenses, which are in most cases the primary cost driver for a nonprofit organization. So what we do here is type in the title of each position: executive director, program director, director of administration. Again, each of the positions, the full-time positions in the organization. This section is based on full-time positions, so this column that says percentage of full-time, that's specific to the personnel section. We, by default, have that as 100%. If you have a full-time person or a person essentially on full-time benefits who works less than 100%, you can actually adjust the number here to a lower number, but by default this is set up as 100%. Then in column C we put the expense budget for that position. So in this case we have an executive director whose salary budget is $70,000, and then in columns D through L we enter the percentage of that position's time which goes to each of the functions, the programs and functions in this organization. So in this case, we have an executive director spending 10% of her time in the elementary school program, 10% in middle school, 10% in high school, 40% in overall administration, and 30% in fundraising. So column M will tally that as you go, as you enter the information, and we're always looking to ultimately total 100%. Then we do the same thing with each other position in the organization until we have listed all of our full-time staff and their salary budget and how they spend their time across the different functions. So to come up with those time percentage assignments or allocations, you might base it on job descriptions. If your organization does timesheets or time studies, you can use that information. But however you do it should ensure that it's a realistic reflection of how each staff person is spending his or her time. Once you complete that, or before you do that, in cell B10 here, you want to enter the effective fringe rate for full-time staff. So fringe benefit cost will then be allocated automatically across your programs based on the staff in those areas. Fringe includes things like payroll taxes, we call that mandatory fringe, and it also includes, particularly for full-time staff, things like medical insurance, sometimes dental insurance or retirement plans. So the number here represents the fringe rate that your organization pays on top of the base salary for each position. One thing to note here is that if you don't know your effective fringe rate, there is a supplemental spreadsheet in this tab that will help you to calculate that. So if you click there, you'll see some instructions, a short list of instructions there, but in essence, you enter your total annual expenses for each of these typical fringe benefit categories, and the spreadsheet will calculate your effective fringe rate for full-time and part-time employees here at the bottom. Then you can take that number and feed it back into the appropriate cells on the budget worksheet. So we have that for full-time staff in this section, and then part-time staff in the next section. And those are usually different because typically part-time staff are not eligible for the same benefits of full-time staff. For example, medical plans and retirement are usually restricted to full-time staff. So for the part-time section, if your organization does have part-time employees, you enter those positions here, and it generally works the same way as the full-time personnel section, with the difference that in column B, we enter the percentage of time that the person in that position actually works. So for example, if it's a half-time position, you would enter 50% for that position in column B. If it's a 1 day per week position, you would enter 20%, and so on. Otherwise, it works just the same as the full-time section above. You enter the base salary here, and then you assign the time of each part-time position in the same way. So if a person is solely devoted to a particular program or function, you put 100% in the appropriate cell, or if their time is split among different programs or functions, you put the appropriate percentage in each column. You will notice in both the full-time and the part-time section and in other sections of the spreadsheet these plus buttons in the column. Again, if you want to enter some additional staff or additional rows, you can click those plus buttons and open up additional rows to enter information. Then we can see in rows 101 to 103 our total salaries, total fringe, and total personnel costs for the organization. In column C, we see that for the organization as a whole, and then in each program or functional column, we see the total salaries, total fringe, and personnel costs for that particular function. Then rows 105 and 106 will show the number of full-time equivalents, or FTEs, in each program or function of the organization. And we see that both on an absolute basis and on the basis of what percentage of the total number of FTEs each program or function represents. That will be important later because this is a percentage that we will use for sharing some of those costs, the shared costs that are common across the organization. A basis that is typically used for sharing those costs is FTEs, or headcount. Scrolling down, next, the non-personnel section is where we will complete the organization's budget by filling in all of the other costs that go into the operating budget. As we discussed earlier, there are two types of non-personnel expenses: specific expenses, which are those incurred directly by one or more programs or functions, and shared expenses, which are those that can't be attributed to a single program or function, but are basically overhead expenses that all of the programs share in. So here in the first section, we enter specific expenses. So in column A, the actual expense category, these should all be natural expenses, things like supplies and travel and professional fees and so on. And in the columns over under the program and function headings, enter the actual dollar amount budgeted to each program for each expense. In our example here, we have amounts of program supplies for each of our 3 program areas. So the elementary program, we have a budget of $5,000 in supplies. The middle school program, we have a budget of $8,000, and the high school program, a budget of $10,000. And then we also have specific expenses associated with administrative and fundraising activities. So we have a fundraising event, that's a specific expense to fundraising. So here you'll see $10,000 showing up in the fundraising column. And our audit expense is a specific expense to the finance function, part of administration. So we have $5,000 assigned to administration for the audit. Again, as we described earlier, if you have additional lines you would like to open up for non-personnel expenses, you can click the plus button here to open up additional lines. So that's how we handle all of our specific non-personnel expenses. For those shared expenses, the ones which each function or program of the organization shares in, we put those in the next section. So you'll see shared expenses allocated by FTE. As a general rule, we recommend using FTEs as the basis for your allocation of shared costs, because typically we're talking about things like rent and utilities and supplies and so on that are really used by all of your staff members about equally. Shared costs that should be allocated on the basis of FTEs are entered into this section, and those costs are allocated automatically in the template based on the FTE percentages that we calculated above based on personnel. So you'll see in this example we've put a couple of common categories of shared expenses, so things like office supplies and paper, telephone and internet charges, and those are spread on a percentage basis across the different columns, again based on the calculations of FTEs that we made in the personnel section. And then the final section of this spreadsheet is where we can enter shared expenses that we might choose to allocate on some basis other than FTEs. Rent and occupancy costs are one example that we see here sometimes. If your organization has a use of space that varies from the way that employees are spread across programs. For example, if one program takes up a disproportionate amount of space because of the nature of the program. So in this case, say we're assuming that the space used for programming is significantly higher than the space used for administrative staff. So here we might allocate those costs on a square footage basis rather than an FTE basis. So we've calculated offline somewhere how much of the overall facility square footage is used by each of the different areas. So the elementary school program uses 20%, the middle school 30%, high school 35%, then administrative and fundraising. Again, all based on the square footage of the facility that they're using. Other possible basis for a cost allocation that might show up in this section could be something like number of students or number of program participants. Again, any expense category that doesn't track with numbers of staff, you might calculate a different basis and use that in this section. So then finally, the bottom rows of the spreadsheet, lines 204 and 205, will tabulate the total budget in two ways. First, by the total expense amount for each program, the dollar amount you see in row 204, for the organization as a whole in column C, and then in columns D through L for each program, administrative, and fundraising function. And also in row 205, by showing what percentage of the overall expense budget each program and function represents. So it's basically a way of looking at your functional expenses based on your budget and the ratios that each program and each function represents of your overall organization's budget. Then to see your organization's budget on a dollar basis, we can click on this Organization Expense Budget tab. This is an output only tab. And here you'll see, rather than all the percentage calculations, you will see actual dollar amounts assigned to each program and function for each line item in the budget. So you can scroll down and maybe use this as a more intuitive way of presenting your budget with dollar numbers rather than percentage numbers. So that gives us an overview of the expense budget for our organization. But of course, then we need to understand where the revenue comes from. Are there any shortfalls? Do we need to go back and revisit any of our expense assumptions? This Revenue and Summary tab will help us to do that. So if we click on that tab, we will see a similar framework, but in this case directed at the revenue side of the budget rather than the expense side of the budget. So we see the same programs, the elementary, middle school, and high school across the top. as our columns, as well as our management and general and fundraising. But then the rows in this worksheet represent the different possible funding sources that are funding our organization. Contributions and support, including foundations, corporations, individual contributions, if we have government grants, contracts, if we have other revenue, and then just an assortment of line items that you could simply overwrite with specific names of corporations, individuals, any way that you would want to track your different revenue sources. And what we will do then is actually put our expected revenue also on a functional basis. So in other words, what program or function within the organization is earning that revenue, or is a donor giving directly to? Perhaps it's a restricted grant or contribution, perhaps it's earned revenue. This template will allow us to represent each of our funding sources by the program or function that that funding source is going toward. This template, this hypothetical, has a few examples already built in. We have Foundation A, which gives a grant of $25,000 that's specific to the elementary school program. So how we would represent that is simply type in $25,000 in this cell. Foundation B gives the organization a $90,000 grant for the middle school program. So we would type $90,000 into this cell corresponding to the middle school program. Foundation C gives us a grant that is unrestricted or for general operating purposes. So there are a few different ways we could represent that. In this case, I've chosen to put it as management in general since it's for general operating support. We could also perhaps consider that fundraising revenue and put it to the fundraising column. As we look down the sheet, we can see additional examples. Let's say that we have board members who give a total of $75,000. Again, that's unrestricted revenue. That can go to any of our programs, or that can go to general operations or administration. I've chosen here to credit that or represent that as fundraising income. Much like the annual appeal, that's a fundraising function, and so I'm showing the $35,000 that's raised by the annual appeal as part of the fundraising revenue. You could also show it as management in general. Again, the border between those two columns can be a bit fuzzy. In either case, basically we are showing general operating or unrestricted support in the M&G and fundraising columns. As we scroll down for other examples, we might have a government contract that funds one or more of our programs. In this case, we have a city youth services contract for our elementary and our high school programs. We might also have program revenues. So let's say, again, in this case, we have some private tuition fees that are associated with each of our programs. So we would represent those numbers here. So the elementary school generates $9,500 in program revenues, the middle school $6,500, and the high school $3,000. All we want to do with this is represent all of our different revenue sources and show how they are associated with a particular program or function. And what we get when we enter all that information is our total revenue by program or function. And we see that the elementary school program generates a total of $59,500 in revenue. The middle school program, $96,500, the high school, $103,000. And then we raise a total of $132,000 in general unrestricted support. And again, we can represent that in different ways. The particular choices we've made here show $40,000 of that to management in general and $92,500 to fundraising. What we see in the next section is the expenses by program and function that were developed on the previous pages. Nothing to input here, that just brings over the expense lines that we calculated earlier. And then as we scroll to the bottom of this sheet, we have our total expenses by program and function. Again, $432,000 for the organization as a whole. And then based on this revenue number, what is essentially the bottom line, the budgeted bottom line for our organization? So what we see is that the organization as a whole, we are currently budgeting at a $40,000 deficit. Each program will also have its own bottom line. So the elementary school program is budgeted at a $7,800 deficit. The middle school program is fairly close to break even. It has a $2,400 deficit. The high school program, $4,200 deficit, and so on. So we can see on this basis where we need perhaps to raise additional funds to target our fundraising efforts, to reduce expenses. It gives us a lot of information about really our organization's business model. In this case, our fundraising function generates $50,000 in excess of the costs to run the fundraising function. So you could think of this as how much money is fundraising bringing in that can subsidize the loss-generating programs and functions. In this case, it's obviously not enough to break even for the organization as a whole, so we might need additional unrestricted fundraising to generate enough revenue to support the management and general function and also the deficits that are being run in each individual program. So this snapshot on a budgeted basis of our organization gives us a lot of information about how to operate moving forward, where we should look at trying to generate additional revenues, or on the other hand, where should we look at reducing expenses to bring those into better balance to run a more sustainable organization. So that gives us a quick walkthrough of the program-based budget builder, one of the tools on strongnonprofits.org. I hope this proves to be a useful tool for your organization. And remember that there are many other tools and resources available for strengthening your nonprofit's financial management here on strongnonprofits.org. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts about this or any of the other tools, please feel free to get in touch with me. My contact information is on the screen in front of you. And again, I thank you for joining us, and I thank you for using the tools here on this site.